Looking at public limited companies, they're PLCs, and they have limited liability as well. Just reminding you of the definition of limited liability. It's where the business and the owners are legally separate, so they're not putting, shareholders are not putting any personal possessions at risk. And I've got the definition of dividends as well. So profits are distributed to shareholders through dividends. That's what we call the profits distributed to them. So a public limited company means it's owned by shareholders. With the difference between this one and the LTD is that shares can be sold on a stock market, and they also have limited liability. So advantages and disadvantages. Now I've included the advantages and disadvantages of the private limited company, the LTD, on the left hand side, because it is, I'll just bring it up there, a past paper question, advise the directors on whether or not the business should become a PLC for 8 marks. So you'd have to compare the LTD to the PLC as well. A lot of the advantages and disadvantages are the same, but there are a few differences, so let's go through them. So they've both got limited liability. Shares can be sold to raise capital, but they can be sold publicly, so this would be on a stock exchange. This picture I had here right at the beginning, that's the London Stock Exchange, the building where the London Stock Exchange is. That's why I put it on this one. They're well known as well, PLCs. They're reported about a lot in the press, so it might be easier to attract shareholders, to introduce that capital, and to attract customers. Customers tend to trust them as well. They're quite heavily regulated. To sell on the London Stock Exchange, you have to follow certain processes and be checked over. So they're quite, well, we think that they're quite trustworthy in general. When they fail, when they go bankrupt, it is quite a shock, and it does make the newspapers because it doesn't happen that often. However, they, just like the LTDs, they have to publish accounts. The accounts are easier to get hold of as well. Google Finance gives you the accounts on lots and lots of PLCs all over the world. So it's a bit easier to find those accounts. So competitors could be looking at those. It's very expensive to set up. So solicitors, accountants would be involved. You have to meet lots of rules and regulations of the stock exchange that you want to sell on. If it's like London Stock Exchange or New York Stock Exchange, you have to meet their rules and regulations. And there is greater divorce of ownership and control between the shareholders and the managers. Now, this means that you might find a situation where the managers aren't acting in the best interest of the shareholders. The shareholders will want to maximise profit, whereas the managers want to maximise their own bonuses, I suppose. They want a nice, easy ride, I suppose. So because the shareholders, there's going to be so many shareholders in a PLC, thousands of shareholders, they're not going to be controlling what's going on the day-to-day running of the business. Also, the original owner of the business, so if we look at like Apple and Steve Jobs, who set up Apple, was one of the founders of Apple, when they become a PLC, and to get to that point, they'd have to be quite large in size. So they've probably taken on loads and loads of investors before that point. And they've probably not got the majority shareholder. They're not the majority shareholder, like 51%. They're probably quite a small shareholder by that point. So maybe like 5-10%. Then it is easy to oust that managing director, that CEO of the company. Whereas if you were the managing director of an LTD and you have 51% of the shares, you're not going to, I presume, vote yourself out of power. So it's a lot easier for the person that set up the business to lose control of the business. They can't lose their shares because that's something that they own, but they could lose control of the business. So as I said before, that's a question that you'd have. Typically, I'd advise doing 3 paragraphs on that. So benefits and problems of staying as they are, benefits and problems of being a public limited company, and then a decision with backing it up with the main reason, obviously all the way through using the data from the case study. If we look at some simpler past paper questions, which 2 of the following apply to a public limited company, it's not going to be that one because that's private limited. There's no maximum amount of shareholders, but shares are sold on the stock exchange, and the name is followed by PLC. One difference, a little bit harder this one difference between a private limited company and a public limited company. Here's what the mark scheme recommends. Shares can be bought on the stock exchange with spoken about that. Hadn't mentioned PLCs must have at least £50,000 share capital to start up, whereas private limited company, just 1p. Divorce of ownership between the managers, ownership and control it's usually called. Accounts more available, I've mentioned that one, and accounts more expensive to produce for a PLC, a lot more checking processes that they need to go through.